Thank you, Peter, for joining me. And I wanted to just give a brief introduction to you for our listeners. So, Peter Oborne is a renowned journalist and writer, and he was a former political commentator of the Spectator, the Daily Telegraph, and the Daily Mail. But now I believe you're an associate editor for the Middle East Eye and a regular political columnist for several independent investigative outlets. And we regularly see you on social media and on YouTube and things like that. So Peter is author of many acclaimed pamphlets and books, including The Triumph of the Political Class and The Rise of Political Lying, The Fate of Abraham, which we will be talking about today, and more recently, Complicit, Britain's role in the destruction of Gaza. So I'm really pleased to have you on my channel to speak about your book, The Fate of Abraham, which is a brilliant book. And you say that it took about 20 years to write, and that it was the Iraq War and its aftermath that triggered you to write. And you say in the book that the turning point for you was Iraq and your realization that the British state was party to a lie about the existence of weapons of mass destruction in order to justify an illegal war, which then led you to re-examine everything that you believed. And before this period, you state that you were conservative in your outlook and you thought of the British state as virtuous, but your experiences, particularly during this time, led you to change this view along with your views and your trust in the British media. So we will talk about these themes as we go along, because I wanted to explore some of the themes further, as well as Islamophobia specifically, which you give a very comprehensive historical and holistic overview of, tracing its origins to much further back than 9/11, which many people sort of start the story with. So the first question that I wanted to ask you was to give our listeners a bit more detail about the context to writing this book, what motivated you, and what is the key message that you would like readers to take away?
To answer your question, I was very upset. I was very upset and annoyed and actually disgusted by the clash of civilizations narrative which accompanied the Iraq war, and it was nonsense. And to see this used as a justification for the invasion of Iraq, and actually not just the invasion of Iraq, it was employed generally about Islam and the Muslim world, and then that followed by the war on terror, as it was called. I found this disturbing, and I didn't like the way that it was brought into British discourse. It came from, broadly speaking, from the United States. It was in through various routes, and actually this is still happening, and it's getting more toxic actually with the MAGA groups. So I was trying to show the study of the long history of British, French, United States with Islam, to try and put everything into proper context and show that the narrative that Muslims were barbaric, uncivilized, etc., was very foolish. And we've seen actually another manifestation recently with this illegal war on Iran launched by the United States and Israel, which was full of incredibly silly and cruel and, above all, ignorant and bigoted remarks from United States and Israeli politicians about the Iranians, which was, in fact, if you look at the leadership of Iran, they're far more sophisticated, intelligent, well-read, etc., than their US counterparts.
Yes. So just moving on from that, just to expand a bit more, because that is one of the striking themes of the book, is that this is quite a long history. You go back to like medieval Christian encounters with Islam, through colonialism and empire, and the idea of the clash of civilizations that followed. And you call it in the book a continuum to the early days of colonial settlement. And so I'm very much of the understanding as well that this Islamophobic rhetoric and behavior is a much more deeply embedded phenomenon. And I just thought if you could explain why is it so important if you're going to look at Islamophobia and try to tackle it, why is it so important to know this historical context?
Well, I don't think it's helpful in any making any judgments about something contemporary to think that whatever it is you're under discussion started yesterday. Generally speaking, there are long historical roots. And in the case of Islamophobia, you can trace it back actually to the very start of Islam, when the first English historian, the Venerable Bede, up there in Whitby, is getting reports of these awful Saracens, and then you get that leads to the Crusades 3 or 4 centuries later, which is an eruption of virulent Islamophobia. Pope Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095, which launched the Crusades, talks about Muslims, an accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God. It's invaded the lands of the Christians and depopulated them, etc. Now, and also then he goes on with the atrocity stories, and it has an extraordinarily contemporary ring. He fabricates sort of rapes, and that is and of course when the Christians did take Jerusalem, they, of course, the chroniclers record that the roads around, were knee deep in blood, and this was not just Muslim blood; it was Jewish blood as well. Mm. And I think one of the themes which I realised is, oddly enough, when Muslims and Jews coexist, it's much healthier, it's much richer, it's a much deeper cultural symbiosis than when the Christians turn up, as they did in Jerusalem at the end of the 11th century. But that's just one example. I mean, the toxic anti-Semitism across Europe in the Middle Ages and beyond, culminating in the Holocaust. Whereas and then take the example of Spain, where medieval Spain, there's a wonderful relationship in Cordoba, Andalusia. The Spanish, the Christian, not the Christian, the Jews and the Muslims really coexisting. It wasn't perfect, but amazing scientific and literary and cultural achievements. Whereas when the Christian, then you get the ethno-nationalist Christians coming down, driving out both the Muslims and the Jews, and of course the Jews are received very generously and welcomed by the Ottoman Empire. So one of the themes might be that, and I've just been looking at a book by Mark David Beer, which is a very similar title to mine. It's Children of Abraham.
Oh, right. I read your book, The Ottomans.
Yeah, but the latest one, and what he talks about the Judeo-Muslim tradition, which is a much better thing, I think a much richer subject to talk about than the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is more of a modern invention.
Yes. So there's a book that's just come out recently by Tariq Hussein, Muslim Europe, and I interviewed him actually quite recently, and he really gets irked by that phrasing of Judeo-Christian civilization of the West totally eliminating any sort of Muslim presence. And that term is frequently used in Western history and politics, which you challenge, but because it excludes Islam, which was part of the story for quite a long time. Why do you think this term is historically problematic, and how does it link in then with Islamophobia?
The term Judeo-Christian, I researched it. It's first used in a review of a book by Stendhal, believe it or not, by George Orwell,
Mm,
in just before World War II. And I can see why intellectuals like Orwell started to use it, because at that moment you had the toxic, I mean, the really frightening, menacing horror of anti-Semitism emerging, and you wanted to bring Jews who had been excluded for a millennia or more from European culture in many ways, certainly Christian European culture, to bring them into the Christian tradition. And I think that was proper and it was understandable. But then but then it gets put to different uses. The term Judeo-Christian, it becomes a weapon, a sort of conceptual weapon in the Cold War, and then later still, it gets deployed in the war on terror. So there's the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is, I'm afraid, when you look at the history of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's a story of Christians tormenting, terrorizing, murdering Jews. That is really the largest part of it. And also, it's difficult to locate. Obviously, there are brilliant Jewish figures in European history, but really, I mean, it cuts out the Enlightenment, really, which is a secular thing. It cuts out all kinds of elements of European civilization, including the genocidal element within European civilization, which is there's no Jewish tradition of genocide, going in, but there's a Christian tradition of or rather a Western European or European tradition of genocide. But the Jews were the receiving end of all of this during that long history.
yes. And I wanted to ask that, particularly after 9/11. So we know there's a historical perception of Muslims, which was negative, let's say. And then after 9/11, Muslims are increasingly being viewed through this lens of security and extremism and being suspect communities, even this term of like non-violent extremism. So not just terrorists, but people's opinions. That's what you mentioned. And I was just wondering, there is a link, but did the war on terror create, do you think, a new form of Islamophobia, or is it really reviving and reshaping a lot of these older ideas? Because you do have these stories and naming of Muslims as barbaric and uncivilized, sexually perverse, and all these really like horrible things. Um, is is it linked? Is it slightly different after 9/11?
I'd say again and again after 9, what you see after 9/11 takes you all the way the old Christian discourse on European Christian discourse on Muslims. Of course, it does. As seen in the the fabrication of Muslim atrocities, the rejection of Muslims as somehow barbaric and uncivilized, the Muslim threat. Now, all of this is redeployed after 9/11. And of course, Al Qaeda is presented as the representative of Islam, which was nothing of the sort. So, yes, I see this. I think it's fair to say, I don't know if you agree with me, really, that the discourse, the language, particularly in the popular media, about Muslims, with all the scare stories about Sharia law and capture of our institutions. These seem to me to be old age, very long-standing tropes about Muslims.
Mm. And in that way, it's more embedded, and that's why it's harder to tackle, I suppose, because that's the other thing you talk about is repeat messaging in the context of, say, media, where media politics in public institutions, where you say that the narratives that are shaped around Muslims and Muslims being framed as the other. And then you've got Edward Said's wonderful work about Orientalism and all of that. And there's this, if you keep repeating, as you say, negative things about Muslims, it becomes much more firmly lodged in people's psyches. And what Tariq Hussein, who wrote Muslim Europe, says, he sort of tongue in cheek says there's kind of like an anti-Muslim DNA. And our I just thought it was interesting how you were talking about the media and how it's so linked to politics and then this sort of Islamophobia industry, and they're all connected. And I was just wondering, like, who is benefiting from this? Like, why is there need to create this enemy or continue this enemy being currently Islam and Muslims, and who is benefiting from it?
Yes, I actually I don't think I use the term other very much. I mean, really, Muslims are presented in the media as the enemy,
Yeah.
or as terrorists, or as people who hate the West. I mean, it's very, very strong, this stuff. Now, who benefits from this discourse? Well, first of all, I think there's no question the security industry, the arms industry. This is particularly in the United States. I think it's people, and so does the media, because it's inflammatory stories about people who aren't like us. They sell newspapers, and this, of course, is true of Britain too. I did a study. I've been doing studying this on and off for 25 years now. The kind of language, the fabrication of stories, the Muslims are, they don't belong to Britain. It's constructed on a number of levels, and after a while, it starts to enter official discourse and official sort of narratives and framing of Muslims through the creation of a fake science based around the idea of radicalization and nonviolent extremism, and that Muslims go on this pathway from being moderate Muslims to being violent or being subversive Muslims. And this is absurd science. Adam Kundami, I think he's called, isn't he? He's done some very good work. I was influenced by his work in the United States.
The Muslims Are Coming, that's a good book.
Yes, I thought that was a fantastic book, and he looks into how these matters are deployed by as I recollect, by the FBI and in order to frame these hapless, innocent people as enemies of the state.
Yes. Yeah, there's a quote that when you're talking about the preventing violent extremism and non-violent extremism, where you said it should be emphasized that all these efforts were expended only on American Muslims. So we're talking about in the American context, that there were no matching programs to prevent the radicalization of white Christian extremists or other groups who were major instigators of domestic terrorism. And we know here as well in the UK that a lot of these prevent referrals, most of them aren't serious. They're just people, public institution workers that have heard somebody say Allahu Akbar or using a rosary, or I think you get these clickers that instead of the rosary you get a clicker. And there was a case locally where the teacher thought a kid was using it and the teacher thought it was a bombing device. And so these get referred to prevent, and then a good percentage of them are just nothing happens. I just think that it's so obvious in a way, the imbalance, yet people in the mainstream just go along with it and do believe, because of these years of thinking of Muslims, as you said, the enemy, that it's just accepted. And interestingly, you talk about the Trojan horse affair and broader questions about institutional responses to Muslim communities, because I've also been exploring, and I'm writing a book about Islamophobia, how it fits within existing DEI, diversity, inclusion, and equality frameworks and anti-racism frameworks, particularly in the current climate about talking about Palestine at work, and you've got lots of NHS workers being reprimanded, freedom of expression, and just having a confident Muslim identity. Do you think that Western institutions are actually equipped to recognize and meaningfully address anti-Muslim discrimination. Because I'm increasingly just becoming more and more disillusioned with it.
I'll give you I've thought quite a lot and written quite a lot about this. I wouldn't say, I'd say two things. First of all, yes, no, they are not equipped. But secondly, that they actually are structured now to be Islamophobic.
Mm.
And so in fact, there's a major movement both in the United States and certainly in Britain to say there is no such thing as Islamophobia. So the mere possibility of being Islamophobic is eradicated. So I'll point you towards a lot of, if you look at the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, they have no way of, they regard the accusation of being Islamophobic as an irritant, as mischievous, actually, because they see it as being now as a defense mechanism used by Muslims against fair criticism and attack. And then, of course, that denial of Islamophobia presents the people leveling false accusations at Muslims, makes them virtuous. They are the victims, and so that is the first point. And so the Conservative Party, I'm pretty certain, so there is no such thing as Islamophobia or large wings of it. Now, that's the first thing. Secondly, I think that Islamophobia has actually become embodied in the structures of the state. Trojan horse is very early an important example. It's where you have the creation of an idea that a bunch of actually rather brilliant, I've got to know some of them, teachers in East Birmingham who absolutely rescued forlorn and forgotten schools. These people are sinister Islamists trying to take over these schools to Islamize them and make them un-British. It's a completely false narrative. It's a lie from start to finish. It's being exposed totally. But this was projected, this was embodied in government reports. British cabinet ministers ordered this, supported this situation. It became part of the formal narrative of the state. And there's never been any inquiry into it, and the teachers' careers are destroyed, and the children's education obviously clearly greatly damaged. Now, that is all state sponsored. I mean, it was a Conservative government, but the Labour didn't complain about it, and it's there. And this narrative of non-violent extremism, paths to radicalization, which were brought in, I think, largely from the States. But I do go into this at the invention of this new language of radicalization, non-violent extremism, and that is now embodied in formal state thinking, and that involved a change in thought, because Britain is a multicultural society. It's accepted that people have different religions, different customs, welcomed it and embraced all of that. And this is actually really an attack on a community to make out the more you are Muslim, the less British you are, which is actually very, very untrue. It's a very nasty narrative.
Yeah. And as well as making others believe that Muslims are alien, the enemy, as Muslims, it's damaging to what the state want is us to live together and be cohesive and talk about assimilation. But if you are imbibing this as a Muslim, you then isolate yourself for protection. So through my study of history, I feel more a sense of belonging because I know about all the interconnectedness of our history and also how Muslims have contributed to Western.
Phenomenally so. I mean, and actually, polls show that the Muslims feel more British than most people. I think probably any other group. I think I'm right in saying so. It's also false, and the idea that you have to, and then the way that certain tropes are utilized against Muslims, to be patriarchal, right?
Yeah,
are made by Tory governments. Almost all of them went to single-sex schools, and
yes, exactly.
It's all not. It's very, very troubling, and I hope that now that we have a new Prime Minister, perhaps Andy Burnham, who will start to address some of these issues. Starmer played on them, you see. He used them
Yes,
electorally.
indeed.
One of the terrible things of Sir Keir Starmer and his political team was that
Mhm.
they dismissed Muslims as shaking off the fleas and this sort of thing. It was
Yeah.
really unpleasant language.
I just wanted to ask you just one final question, if that's okay. And it's just about this concept, like, is the West finally like facing a wider reckoning with its own history and the impacts of empire, colonialism, and as Malcolm X said, is it like the chickens coming home to roost? And what do you think is going to happen now? Because it just feels like it's getting worse and worse.
Yes, I think there is a greater consciousness um, about the genocidal history of the West. Um, and it's difficult for people, and I understand this, to come to terms with. If you study history, you can study the elimination of the Tasmanians by British settlers, so semi-authorized by the state. You can, Southwest Africa, the Germans are sort of sending native people off into the desert to die. You got again and again. It is a repetitive feature. The atrocities in the Congo, uh, the new concept of settler colonialism, which
Mm.
I think it needs to fight. Maybe it needs to be less. It's so threatening to Western identities. But
Mm.
actually, my view is that actually I feel very proud to be British. I love being British, but we have to embrace the fact that we committed terrible crimes in our past, as have other nations and so on. So I don't, but I think that's part of discovering and learning who we are, and yes, and understanding our ancient relationships and friendships. It's not and deepening our understanding of ourselves, because that is the culture we have come from.
Mm.
It's not all bad, by the way. There are great literary,
Yes.
political, Parliament, the rule of law. There are all kinds of things you can point to, which are fantastic. Yeah,
Mm.
it's just that it's not all marvelous, and I think, and a lot of it is terrifying.
Yes.
And it's a part of coming to terms with our humanity and understanding the importance of the rule of law.
Yes. Thank you so much. It's been amazing speaking to you. It's I've been wanting to speak to you for a long time, so thank you for giving me the time, and thank you for everything that you do to speak up about all these issues and being such an ally. So I hope you have a lovely evening, and
You
thank
too.
you.